The rain had just begun to fall when Elena Hart stepped onto the tarmac, her hand resting gently on her rounded belly. The private jet gleamed under the floodlights, its engines humming softly, ready to take her far away from the life she once knew. She didn't look back. Not at the city skyline. Not at the black SUV idling behind her. And certainly not at the man who had once promised her forever. Inside the jet, a steward offered her a warm towel and a glass of sparkling water. She accepted both with a polite nod, her mind elsewhere. Her phone buzzed again, the 12th missed call from Adrian. She silenced it. There was nothing left to say. Just hours earlier, Elena had walked into the penthouse she shared with her husband, Adrian Cole, a millionaire tech investor known for his charm, his ambition, and, as she had just discovered, his lies. She had returned early from her prenatal appointment, excited to surprise him with the news. They were having a girl. She had even bought a tiny pink onesie with Daddy's princess embroidered across the front. But the surprise had been hers. The elevator doors opened directly into their living room. She stepped out, calling his name. No answer. Then she heard it: laughter. A woman's laughter. It came from the bedroom. She walked slowly, her heart pounding. The door was ajar. She pushed it open. There he was. Adrian. Shirtless. Tangled in silk sheets with a woman Elena had never seen before. A model. Maybe. Blonde. Younger. Laughing like she belonged there. Adrian's eyes widened when he saw Elena. He scrambled to sit up, stammering her name. But she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him, then at the woman, then back at him. I came to tell you we're having a daughter, she said, her voice calm, almost detached. But I suppose you're busy. She turned and walked out. Adrian followed, pleading, apologizing, swearing it meant nothing. That he was stressed. That he made a mistake. That he still loved her. But Elena had already made a call. To someone she hadn't spoken to in months. Julian Black. A billionaire venture capitalist. Adrian's former mentor. And Elena's former flame. Julian had always been there in the background, watching, waiting. He had warned her about Adrian once. She hadn't listened. But now, when she called, he answered on the first ring. I need to leave, she said. I'll send the jet, he replied. And now, here she was, buckled into a leather seat, watching the city shrink beneath her as the jet ascended into the clouds. Back in the penthouse, Adrian stood alone, the pink onesie crumpled in his hand. The mistress had left. She hadn't signed up for drama. He tried calling Elena again. Voicemail. He paced the floor, replaying everything. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. The affair had started during Elena's second trimester, when she was tired, distant, focused on the baby. He felt neglected, unseen, and the attention from someone new had been intoxicating. But now, the reality hit him like a freight train. His wife was gone. His unborn child gone. And the man she had turned to was the one person Adrian couldn't compete with. Julian Black was everything Adrian wasn't. Older, wiser, richer. And he had always carried a torch for Elena. Julian met Elena at the private airstrip in Geneva. He helped her down the steps, his eyes softening when he saw her belly. You look radiant, he said. She smiled faintly. I feel tired. You'll rest here. As long as you need. He took her to his estate, a sprawling villa overlooking Lake Geneva. The staff welcomed her like royalty. A doctor was on call. A nursery was already being prepared. Elena spent the first few days in silence, walking the gardens, reading, sleeping. Julian gave her space. But he was always nearby, a quiet presence, a steady hand. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the terrace, he spoke. I never stopped loving you, he said. Elena looked at him, tears brimming. I know. He reached for her hand. I don't expect anything. I just want you to be safe. And happy. She squeezed his hand. You make me feel both. Meanwhile, Adrian spiraled. The media caught wind of Elena's departure. Rumors swirled. Investors pulled out. His company's stock dipped. He tried to spin the story, claimed Elena needed rest, that she was visiting family. But the truth leaked. Photos of her boarding Julian's jet. Headlines screamed betrayal, not hers, but his. He flew to Geneva, uninvited. Showed up at Julian's estate, demanding to see her. Julian met him at the gate. "She doesn't want to see you," he said. "She's my wife." Adrian shouted. "Not anymore." Adrian's fists clenched. "You think you've won?" "This isn't a game," Julian replied. "You lost the moment you chose someone else over her." Adrian left, humiliated. Elena watched from the window, her heart heavy. She didn't hate Adrian. She pitied him. He had everything and threw it away. Months passed. Elena gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Grace. Julian was there, holding her hand, tears in his eyes as he cut the cord. "You're incredible," he whispered. Elena smiled, cradling Grace. "We both are." Adrian sent flowers, a letter, apologies, promises. But Elena didn't respond. She was building a new life, one rooted in truth, in love, in peace. And as she rocked her daughter to sleep, Julian beside her, she knew she had made the right choice. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not anger, it's happiness. And she had found hers. Elena Hart stood on the balcony of Julian Black's Geneva estate, the crisp mountain air brushing her cheeks as she cradled her newborn daughter, Grace. The lake shimmered below, and the villa behind her buzzed with quiet luxury. But Elena's mind wasn't on the view. It was on the life she had left behind, the man who had shattered her trust, and the woman she was becoming. Grace stirred in her arms, her tiny fingers curling around Elena's thumb. She looked down at her daughter and whispered, "You deserve better. And I promise you'll have it." Julian stepped onto the balcony, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He handed one to Elena and kissed her temple. "She's perfect," he said. "She is," Elena replied. "And she's mine." Julian smiled. "Ours, if you'll let me." Elena looked at him, the man who had loved her quietly, patiently, without condition. She hadn't said yes yet. Not to marriage. Not to forever. But she hadn't said no either. Back in New York, Adrian Cole was unraveling. The media had turned on him. Investors were wary. His company's board had called an emergency meeting to discuss his personal distractions. The Mistress, a model named Brielle, had sold her story to a tabloid, painting Adrian as manipulative and emotionally abusive. Whether true or not, the damage was done. Adrian sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the pink onesie Elena had left behind. Daddy's princess. The irony was cruel. He tried reaching out again. Emails, letters, even a video message, begging Elena to let him meet his daughter. But she didn't respond. Julian intercepted one of the letters and handed it to Elena. "He's desperate," Julian said. "But that doesn't mean he's changed." Elena read the letter. It was full of apologies, promises, and pleas. But it lacked one thing: accountability. "He still doesn't get it," she said. "He thinks saying sorry is enough." Julian nodded. "You don't owe him anything." But Elena wasn't sure. Grace had a right to know her father, even if he was flawed. So she made a decision. She flew to New York alone, leaving Grace with Julian and the nanny. She didn't tell Adrian she was coming. She wanted to see him as he was, not as he pretended to be. She arrived at the penthouse unannounced. The doorman recognized her and let her up. Adrian opened the door, stunned. "Elena," he breathed. "I came to talk," she said. He stepped aside and she walked in. The place was a mess, dishes piled up, papers scattered, curtains drawn. "You look tired," she said. "I haven't slept," he admitted. "I've been thinking about you." "About her?" "She's beautiful," Elena said. "And she deserves better than this." Adrian sat down, burying his face in his hands. "I messed up. I know. I was selfish. I thought I could have it all." "You had it all," Elena said. "And you threw it away." He looked up, eyes red. "Can I see her?" Elena hesitated. "Not yet. You need to prove you're stable, that you're safe." "I'll do anything," he said. "Then start by fixing yourself," she replied. "Not for me. For her." She left without hugging him. without promising anything. But she left the door open, just a crack. Back in Geneva, Julian was waiting at the airport. "How did it go?" he asked. "He's broken," Elena said. "But maybe that's what he needed." Julian nodded. "And you?" "I'm whole," she said. For the first time in a long time. Months passed. Grace grew, her laugh filling the villa, her tiny feet pattering across marble floors. Elena wrote a memoir, detailing her journey from betrayal to rebirth. It became a bestseller, inspiring women around the world. Adrian read it, every word, and it changed him. He started therapy, stepped down from his company, volunteered at shelters. Slowly, he rebuilt himself, not for Elena, but for Grace. One day, Elena received a letter. Handwritten. No pleading. No manipulation. Just truth. "I was a coward," Adrian wrote. "I hurt you. I hurt myself. But I'm trying to be better. I hope one day, Grace will know that." Elena cried when she read it. Not because she missed him, but because she forgave him. She invited him to Geneva. Julian was supportive. "She deserves to know both sides of her story," he said. Adrian arrived, nervous. He met Grace in the garden, where she was chasing butterflies. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "She's strong," Elena replied. Adrian knelt down. "Hi, Grace. I'm your dad." Grace looked at him, curious. Then she smiled. They spent the afternoon together, playing, laughing, learning. Julian watched from the terrace, his heart full. That night, Elena sat with Julian by the fire. "You've given me everything," she said. "You gave me a reason," he replied. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a ring, the one Julian had given her months ago. "I'm ready," she said, "to say yes." Julian smiled, tears in his eyes. "Then let's begin." They married in the garden, surrounded by friends, family, and a little girl who danced in a pink dress that read, "Mommy's Miracle." Adrian attended the wedding. He stood in the back, smiling, clapping, grateful. Because sometimes love isn't about possession. It's about letting go. Grace was nearly 2 years old when Elena received the invitation. It was embossed in gold, sealed with a crest she hadn't seen in years, the Cole family insignia. Adrian's father, Richard Cole, was turning 75, and the family was hosting a gala in Manhattan. Elena hadn't spoken to Adrian in months. Their co-parenting arrangement was distant but respectful. He visited Grace twice a year, sent gifts, and kept his distance from Julian. But this invitation felt different. Julian read it over her shoulder. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know," Elena replied. "But maybe I should." Julian nodded. "If you do, go as yourself. Not as his ex-wife. As Elena Hart." She smiled. "I like the sound of that." The gala was held at the Metropolitan Club, chandeliers, string quartets, champagne fountains. Elena arrived in a navy silk gown, her hair swept up, Grace on her hip. Julian walked beside her, dashing in a tailored tuxedo. Whispers followed them. Cameras flashed. But Elena kept her head high. Adrian spotted them from across the room. He looked older, more grounded. He approached slowly, unsure. "Hi," he said. Elena nodded. "Hello." He knelt to greet Grace, who blinked at him, then offered him her stuffed bunny. "She remembers you," Elena said. "I think about her every day," Adrian replied. Julian gave them space, stepping aside. "I'm glad you came," Adrian said. "My father insisted. He's been asking about you." Elena raised an eyebrow. "About me?" "He regrets how he treated you. We all do." Elena glanced around the room. The opulence, the legacy, the weight of old money. "I don't need apologies," she said. "I just need peace." Adrian nodded. "You deserve it." They spoke briefly, then parted. Julian returned to her side, slipping his hand into hers. "You okay?" he asked. "I am," she said. "More than ever." Back in Geneva, life resumed its quiet rhythm. Grace started preschool. Elena launched a podcast based on her memoir, stories of women who rebuilt their lives after betrayal. It became a global sensation. Julian proposed again, this time with Grace holding the ring. Elena laughed, tears in her eyes. Yes, she said. Yes to all of it. They married in Tuscany, under olive trees, with Grace as their flower girl. Adrian sent a letter, no drama, no expectations. Just congratulations. Years passed. Grace grew into a curious, confident girl. Elena's podcast expanded into a foundation supporting single mothers. Julian retired from venture capital and opened a vineyard. Adrian remarried, quietly, respectfully, and remained a part of Grace's life. One summer evening, Elena sat on the porch of their villa, watching the sunset. Grace was painting beside her. Julian brought out wine and strawberries. You ever think about how it all started? He asked. Elena smiled. Every day. And I thank it for leading me here. Julian kissed her hand. To astonishing journeys. Elena raised her glass. To choosing joy. And as the sun dipped below the hills, she knew the past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. She had rewritten her story. And it was beautiful. Elena Hart stood at the edge of the vineyard, watching the sun dip behind the hills of Tuscany. Grace, now 4 years old, ran between the rows of grapevines, her laughter echoing like music. Julian Black leaned against the porch railing, sipping a glass of wine, his eyes fixed on Elena. You've built something beautiful, he said. Elena turned, her eyes soft. We built it. It had been 5 years since she boarded Julian's jet, leaving behind betrayal and heartbreak. In that time, she had transformed, not just her surroundings but herself. The woman who once walked away from a cheating husband was now a best-selling author, a podcast host, and the founder of a global foundation supporting women who had been silenced, abandoned, or betrayed. Her memoir, Unwritten Vows, had sold over 1 million copies. Her podcast, The Astonishing Journey, featured stories from women around the world, tales of resilience, reinvention, and redemption. And her foundation, Grace Rising, had opened shelters in 6 countries. Julian had been her anchor. He never pushed, never demanded. He simply stood beside her, offering strength when she faltered and space when she needed to breathe. They had married quietly, in a ceremony under olive trees, with Grace tossing petals and giggling through the vows. It wasn't grand. It wasn't public. But it was perfect. Adrian Cole had faded from the headlines. After the scandal, he sold his company, retreated from the spotlight, and focused on rebuilding his life. He remarried, a quiet, kind woman named Naomi, and they had a son, Ezra. Adrian remained in Grace's life, visiting twice a year, sending letters and gifts, and respecting the boundaries Elena had set. One autumn, Elena received an invitation to speak at a global summit on women's leadership in New York. She accepted, and Julian offered to accompany her, but she declined. I need to do this alone, she said. He understood. The summit was held at the Lincoln Center, with thousands in attendance. Elena took the stage, wearing a tailored white suit, her voice steady as she shared her story. I was betrayed, she said. But I wasn't broken. I was abandoned, but I wasn't lost. I chose to rise. Not for revenge, but for grace. The crowd erupted in applause. After the speech, a young woman approached her backstage. I read your book, she said. It saved me. Elena hugged her. You saved yourself. Later that evening, Elena walked through Central Park, reflecting on how far she'd come. She passed the bench where Adrian had once proposed. She paused, then kept walking. Back in Tuscany, Julian greeted her with flowers and Grace ran into her arms. I missed you, Grace said. I missed you more. That night, Elena sat by the fire, writing the first pages of her second book, Grace Rising, The Power of Choosing Yourself. She wrote about the quiet strength of motherhood, the courage of forgiveness, and the beauty of building a life from ashes. She wrote about Julian, the man who loved her without condition. She wrote about Adrian, the man who taught her what love wasn't. And she wrote about Grace, the child who gave her purpose. Years passed. Grace grew into a brilliant, compassionate young woman. She studied art and psychology, traveled the world, and eventually joined her mother's foundation. Julian retired from business and spent his days painting, gardening, and teaching Grace how to make wine. Elena continued to write, speak, and lead. Her work touched millions. Her story became a movement. One spring morning, Elena received a letter from Naomi, Adrian's wife. "He's sick," it read. "Stage 4. He's asking for you." Elena sat with the letter for hours. Then she packed a bag and flew to New York. Adrian was in a hospice, frail but lucid. "You came," he whispered. "I did," she said. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything." "I forgave you a long time ago," she replied. They talked for hours, about Grace, about life, about regrets. Before she left, Adrian handed her a box. "For Grace," he said. "Letters. Photos. Memories." Elena took it, tears in her eyes. "She'll know you tried." Adrian passed away 2 weeks later. At his memorial, Elena stood beside Naomi and Ezra, holding Grace's hand. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply honored the man who had once been her beginning, and who had, in his own way, found peace. Back in Tuscany, Elena placed the box in Grace's room. "These are from your father," she said. Grace opened it slowly, reading each letter, studying each photo. "He loved you," Elena said, "in his own way." Grace nodded. "And I love you. In every way." Elena smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. That night, as the stars blanketed the sky, Elena stood on the balcony, Julian beside her. "You've lived many lives," he said. "I've lived one astonishing journey," she replied. And as the wind carried the scent of lavender and the vineyard glowed in moonlight, Elena knew her story was complete. Not because it ended, but because it had become everything she never knew she needed. The Tuscan sun filtered through the olive trees, casting golden light across the vineyard. Elena stood barefoot in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, planting lavender with Grace, now a bright and curious 10-year-old. Her daughter's laughter rang out as she chased butterflies between the rows of grapevines, her curls bouncing, her cheeks flushed with joy. Julian watched from the terrace, sketchbook in hand. He had taken up painting again, capturing the quiet beauty of their life. The vineyard, the hills, the woman he loved, and the child who had become his own. Elena had never imagined this life. Not when she boarded that jet a decade ago, heartbroken and pregnant, fleeing betrayal. But now, she couldn't imagine anything else. Her foundation, Grace Rising, had grown into a global movement. With centers in over 20 countries, it provided shelter, education, and legal aid to women escaping abusive or toxic relationships. Elena traveled often, giving talks, meeting survivors, and mentoring young leaders. But she always returned home, to Julian, to Grace, to the vineyard that had become their sanctuary. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Grace asked a question that had been quietly forming for years. "Mom, why did you leave Dad?" Elena and Julian exchanged a glance. They had always promised honesty, age-appropriate but truthful. Elena set down her fork. "Because he made a choice that hurt me, and I had to make a choice to protect myself and you." Grace nodded slowly. "Do you still love him?" Elena smiled gently. "I love the part of him that gave me you, but the rest, I've let go." Julian reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Grace looked between them and smiled. "I'm glad you did," she said, "because I love our life." That night, Elena sat on the porch, watching the stars. Julian joined her, wrapping a blanket around their shoulders. "She's growing up," he said. "She's becoming everything I hoped she'd be," Elena replied. Julian kissed her temple. "So are you." A few weeks later, Elena received an invitation to speak at the United Nations, a keynote address on global women's empowerment. It was the highest honor of her career. She accepted, and the family flew to New York together. The city was a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and rehearsals. Grace was dazzled by the lights, the skyscrapers, the energy. Julian took her to museums and bookstores while Elena prepared her speech. On the day of the address, Elena stood backstage, nerves fluttering in her stomach. She wore a sleek navy suit, her hair pinned back, her heart steady. Julian kissed her hand. "You were born for this." Grace hugged her tightly. "You're my hero." Elena stepped onto the stage to a standing ovation. She looked out at the sea of faces, diplomats, activists, world leaders, and began. "I stand before you not as a victim, but as a voice. Not as a survivor, but as a builder. I was betrayed, yes. But I was also reborn. And in that rebirth, I found purpose." She spoke of Grace, of Julian, of the millions of women who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Tears streamed down faces. Elena stood tall, radiant whole. After the event, a woman approached her, tall, elegant, with familiar eyes. "Elena," she said. "I'm Naomi, Adrian's wife." Elena's breath caught. "Of course." Naomi smiled. "He passed away last year. Peacefully. He spoke of you often. And of Grace." Elena nodded, emotion rising. "I'm sorry for your loss." "He left something for you," Naomi said, handing her a small envelope. "He said you'd know when to open it." Back in Tuscany, Elena sat in her study, the envelope in her hands. Julian and Grace were in the vineyard, laughing in the distance. She opened it. Inside was a letter. "Elena, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope I earned your peace. Thank you for raising Grace with love. Thank you for showing me what strength looks like. I hope she knows I loved her, even if I didn't always know how to show it. Tell her I'm proud. Tell her she comes from fire and from light. And tell Julian thank you. Adrian." Elena folded the letter, tears slipping down her cheeks. She walked outside, found Julian, and wrapped her arms around him. "He said thank you," she whispered. Julian held her close. Then maybe he found peace too. Years passed. Grace graduated with honors, started her own nonprofit, and traveled the world. Elena and Julian grew older, their love deepening with each season. One autumn, as the leaves turned gold, Elena stood at the edge of the vineyard, watching the sun set. Julian joined her, his hand in hers. "Do you ever think about how it all began?" he asked. "Every day," she said. "And I wouldn't change a thing. Because from betrayal came strength. From heartbreak came healing. And from one astonishing journey came a life more beautiful than she had ever imagined." The morning sun spilled across the Tuscan hills, casting long shadows over the vineyard. Elena stood at the edge of the terrace, sipping her coffee, watching Grace, now 13, sketching in her notebook beneath the olive tree. Her daughter had inherited Julian's quiet intensity and Elena's fire. She was thoughtful, artistic, and fiercely independent. Julian joined Elena, wrapping an arm around her waist. "She's growing up fast," he said. Elena nodded. "Too fast." Grace had recently asked to attend a boarding school in Switzerland, one focused on global leadership and the arts. Elena had hesitated. She wasn't ready to let go. But Julian had reminded her. "We raised her to fly." The decision had been made. Grace would leave in the fall. Elena spent the summer soaking in every moment, picnics by the lake, late-night talks, baking lessons, and long walks through the vineyard. Grace was excited, nervous, and determined. "I want to make a difference," she said one evening. "Like you." Elena smiled. "You already do." Meanwhile, Elena's foundation, Grace Rising, was expanding rapidly. She was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum, consulted by governments, and featured in documentaries. Her second book, Grace Rising, The Power of Choosing Yourself, had become a global bestseller. But with success came scrutiny. A journalist published a profile questioning Julian's role in Elena's rise, suggesting he was the real architect behind her empire. The article went viral, sparking debates and backlash. Elena was furious. "He's never asked for credit," she said. "He's never needed it." Julian, ever calm, shrugged. "Let them talk. We know the truth." Still, the article stirred old wounds. Elena remembered the years she spent rebuilding herself, the sleepless nights, the fear, the doubt. She had earned every step of her journey. She wrote a response, not a rebuttal, but a reflection. I am not the product of a man's vision, she wrote. I am the result of my own resilience. Julian didn't build me. He stood beside me while I built myself. The essay was published in The Atlantic. It was shared millions of times. Grace read it and said, "You're a warrior." Elena smiled. "So are you." As summer ended, Grace packed her bags. Elena drove her to the school, tears brimming as she hugged her goodbye. "Be brave," she whispered. "Always," Grace replied. Back in Tuscany, the house felt quieter. Julian painted more. Elena wrote more. They traveled to Kenya, to Brazil, to Iceland, speaking, learning, giving. One evening, Elena received a call from Naomi, Adrian's widow. "Ezra wants to meet Grace," she said. "He's 16. He's curious." Elena hesitated. Grace had never met her half-brother, but she agreed. They arranged a meeting in Geneva. Grace was nervous but excited. Ezra was tall, thoughtful, and kind. He looked like Adrian but softer. They talked for hours about art, music, their parents, their dreams. Afterward, Grace hugged Elena.
"Thank you," she said,
"for letting me know him." Elena nodded. "You deserve every piece of your story." The years rolled on. Grace graduated with honors, launched her own nonprofit, and became a global youth ambassador. Elena and Julian grew older, their love deepening with each season. One winter, Julian fell ill. A rare autoimmune condition. Elena stayed by his side, holding his hand through treatments, whispering stories, singing lullabies. Grace flew home, curled beside him, reading poetry. Julian smiled through the pain. "I've lived a good life," he said, "because I lived it with you." He passed away on a quiet morning, the vineyard bathed in golden light. Elena buried him beneath the olive tree, where Grace had once sketched. She built a memorial garden, a place of peace, of memory, of love. Grace took over the vineyard, blending wine and wisdom. Elena continued her work, now with Grace beside her. One day, Elena stood at the edge of the terrace, watching the sun rise. She whispered, "Thank you." To Julian, to Adrian, to herself, because every betrayal had led her here. Every heartbreak had carved space for healing, and every choice had shaped a life more beautiful than she had ever imagined. The vineyard was quiet in the weeks after Julian's funeral. The olive trees stood still, the grapevines heavy with fruit, and the house echoed with the absence of his laughter. Elena moved through the days like a ghost, tending to the land, answering emails, and sitting for hours in Julian's studio, where his last unfinished painting still rested on the easel, a portrait of her and Grace beneath the olive tree. Grace, now 21, had returned home from university to be with her mother. She took over the vineyard's operations, working with the staff, learning the rhythms of the land Julian had loved. She was grieving too, but she carried it differently, with quiet strength and a determination to honor the man who had raised her. One evening, Elena found a letter tucked inside Julian's sketchbook. "My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But don't let grief steal your fire. You are still the woman who boarded a jet and rewrote her story. You are still the mother who raised a miracle. And you are still the love of my life. Live boldly. Love deeply. And when you're ready, paint again.
J."
Elena wept as she read it, her tears falling onto the page. She hadn't painted in years, not since before Grace was born. But the next morning, she opened the studio windows, pulled on one of Julian's old shirts, and began. The canvas was blank, but her heart was full. She painted for hours, not for galleries or critics, but for herself. For Julian. For Grace. Word of her return to painting spread quickly. A gallery in Florence reached out, asking to feature her work. She declined at first, but Grace encouraged her. "Let the world see what I've always seen," she said. Elena agreed. The exhibition was titled Rewritten, a collection of portraits, landscapes, and abstract pieces that told the story of her journey. It was a sensation. Critics called it a masterclass in emotional storytelling through color. Meanwhile, Grace launched a new initiative through the Grace Rising Foundation, a mentorship program for young women in rural communities. She traveled to Ghana, India, and Colombia, working with local leaders, building schools, and creating safe spaces. Elena joined her on several trips, giving talks, hosting workshops, and painting murals with the girls. Together, mother and daughter became a global force, a symbol of what healing, love, and purpose could look like. One summer, while in Nairobi, Grace met someone. His name was Elias, a Kenyan-American architect working on sustainable housing projects. He was thoughtful, funny, and passionate about community development. Grace was smitten. Elena watched their relationship blossom with a mix of joy and nostalgia. She saw echoes of her younger self in Grace, the same fire, the same hunger for meaning. Elias visited Tuscany that fall. He helped harvest grapes, cooked dinner with Grace, and asked Elena for her blessing. "I love her," he said, "and I want to build a life with her, one rooted in everything you've taught her." Elena smiled. "Then you already have my blessing." They married the following spring, in the vineyard, beneath the olive tree where Julian was buried. Elena walked Grace down the aisle, her heart full of love and memory. After the ceremony, Elena stood alone for a moment, looking out over the hills. "Did you see her?" she whispered. "She's everything we dreamed she'd be." A breeze rustled the leaves. She smiled. Years passed. Grace and Elias had twins, a boy and a girl. They named them Julian and Alara. Elena became Nonna, spending her days painting, writing, and chasing toddlers through the vineyard. Her third book, The Olive Tree, was a memoir about love, loss, and legacy. It became her most personal and most celebrated work. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, Elena sat on the porch with her grandchildren in her lap. "Tell us a story," Alara said. Elena smiled. "Once upon a time, there was a woman who thought her life was over. But then she boarded a jet. And so she told them, not just a story but a legacy, of heartbreak and healing, of betrayal and beauty, of a journey that began with loss and ended with love. Because some stories don't end. They echo.
They grow.
They become the roots of something greater." And Elena's story, her astonishing journey, would live on in every life she touched. The vineyard was quiet in the early morning, dew still clinging to the leaves. Elena, now in her early 60s, walked slowly between the rows, her fingers brushing the vines. She paused at the olive tree where Julian was buried, kneeling to place fresh lavender at its base. "I miss you," she whispered, "but I carry you with me." Inside the house, Grace was preparing for a video conference with her nonprofit's global team. She was now 31, a mother of twins, and the executive director of Grace Rising International. Her husband Elias had taken the children to school, giving her a few hours of quiet before the day began. Elena watched her daughter from the doorway, pride swelling in her chest. Grace had become everything she had hoped: strong, compassionate, visionary. She had taken the foundation to new heights, partnering with governments, launching education programs, and mentoring young leaders. After the meeting, Grace joined Elena on the terrace. "I've been thinking," she said, "about writing a book." Elena smiled. "You should. Your story is powerful." "I want to tell it from the beginning," Grace said. "From the moment you chose to leave Dad. From the jet. From Julian." Elena nodded. "Then tell it. But tell it as your own." Grace began writing that fall. She interviewed Elena, read old letters, watched recordings of speeches. She traveled to New York to meet Naomi and Ezra, gathering pieces of her father's legacy. She returned with a deeper understanding, not just of Adrian, but of the choices that shaped her life. Her book, The Jet That Changed Everything, was published the following spring. It was raw, honest, and deeply moving. Readers praised its emotional depth, its clarity, and its courage. Grace didn't shy away from the pain. She honored it, examined it, and transformed it. Elena read it cover to cover, tears streaming down her face. You've given voice to so many, she said, including me. Grace's book led to a documentary, a speaking tour, and a new wave of support for Grace Rising. She was invited to the White House, the UN, and the Vatican. She spoke of forgiveness, of resilience, of the power of choosing joy. Meanwhile, Elena began painting again, not for galleries, but for herself. Her studio became a sanctuary, filled with canvases that told stories of love, loss, and rebirth. She painted Julian, Grace, the vineyard, the jet, the olive tree. Each brushstroke was a memory, a moment, a truth. One day, Grace found a letter tucked inside one of Julian's old books. To Grace, if you ever wonder who you are, remember this. You are the daughter of courage. You were born from fire and raised in light. You are the echo of every choice your mother made to protect you. And you are the reason I believed in love again. Julian. Grace framed the letter and hung it in her office. Years passed. Elena grew older, her hair silver, her steps slower. But her spirit remained fierce. She continued to mentor, to paint, to write. Her final book, The Olive Tree Diaries, was a collection of essays, poems, and reflections. It became a classic, studied in universities, quoted in speeches, cherished by readers. Grace's children grew. Julian Jr. and Alara, bright, curious, and kind. They knew their grandmother's story by heart. They knew about the jet, the betrayal, the vineyard, the love. They knew that strength wasn't loud, it was steady. One summer evening, the family gathered under the olive tree for Elena's birthday. Grace gave a toast. To the woman who taught me that leaving isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That love isn't possession, it's presence. And that every ending is the beginning of something astonishing. Elena smiled, tears in her eyes. I didn't know where that jet would take me, she said. But I'm glad it brought me here. And as the sun dipped below the hills, casting golden light across the vineyard, Elena looked around, at Grace, at her grandchildren, at the life she had built, and knew her journey was complete. Not because it ended, but because it had become a legacy. The vineyard was quiet in the early morning, dew still clinging to the leaves. Elena, now in her early 60s, walked slowly between the rows, her fingers brushing the vines. She paused at the olive tree where Julian was buried, kneeling to place fresh lavender at its base. I miss you, she whispered, but I carry you with me. Inside the house, Grace was preparing for a video conference with her nonprofit's global team. She was now 31, a mother of twins, and the executive director of Grace Rising International. Her husband Elias had taken the children to school, giving her a few hours of quiet before the day began. Elena watched her daughter from the doorway, pride swelling in her chest. Grace had become everything she had hoped: strong, compassionate, visionary. She had taken the foundation to new heights, partnering with governments, launching education programs, and mentoring young leaders. After the meeting, Grace joined Elena on the terrace. I've been thinking, she said, about writing a book. Elena smiled. You should. Your story is powerful. I want to tell it from the beginning, Grace said. From the moment you chose to leave Dad. From the jet. From Julian. Elena nodded. Then tell it. But tell it as your own. Grace began writing that fall. She interviewed Elena, read old letters, watched recordings of speeches. She traveled to New York to meet Naomi and Ezra, gathering pieces of her father's legacy. She returned with a deeper understanding, not just of Adrian, but of the choices that shaped her life. Her book, The Jet That Changed Everything, was published the following spring. It was raw, honest, and deeply moving. Readers praised its emotional depth, its clarity, and its courage. Grace didn't shy away from the pain. She honored it, examined it, and transformed it. Elena read it cover to cover, tears streaming down her face. You've given voice to so many, she said, including me. Grace's book led to a documentary, a speaking tour, and a new wave of support for Grace Rising. She was invited to the White House, the UN, and the Vatican. She spoke of forgiveness, of resilience, of the power of choosing joy. Meanwhile, Elena began painting again, not for galleries, but for herself. Her studio became a sanctuary, filled with canvases that told stories of love, loss, and rebirth. She painted Julian, Grace, the vineyard, the jet, the olive tree. Each brushstroke was a memory, a moment, a truth. One day, Grace found a letter tucked inside one of Julian's old books. To Grace, if you ever wonder who you are, remember this. You are the daughter of courage. You were born from fire and raised in light. You are the echo of every choice your mother made to protect you. And you are the reason I believed in love again. Julian. Grace framed the letter and hung it in her office. Years passed. Elena grew older, her hair silver, her steps slower. But her spirit remained fierce. She continued to mentor, to paint, to write. Her final book, The Olive Tree Diaries, was a collection of essays, poems, and reflections. It became a classic, studied in universities, quoted in speeches, cherished by readers. Grace's children grew, Julian Jr. and Alara, bright, curious, and kind. They knew their grandmother's story by heart. They knew about the jet, the betrayal, the vineyard, the love. They knew that strength wasn't loud, it was steady. One summer evening, the family gathered under the olive tree for Elena's birthday. Grace gave a toast. To the woman who taught me that leaving isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That love isn't possession, it's presence. And that every ending is the beginning of something astonishing. Elena smiled, tears in her eyes. I didn't know where that jet would take me, she said. But I'm glad it brought me here. And as the sun dipped below the hills, casting golden light across the vineyard, Elena looked around, at Grace, at her grandchildren, at the life she had built, and knew her journey was complete. Not because it ended, but because it had become a legacy. The vineyard was in bloom again. Spring had returned to Tuscany, and with it, the scent of jasmine and the hum of bees weaving through the vines. Elena sat beneath the olive tree, a sketch pad in her lap, her silver hair braided loosely down her back. Her hands, once steady with a brush, now trembled slightly with age, but her eyes still held the same fire, the same clarity that had carried her through decades of transformation. Julian Jr. and Alara, now teenagers, were helping with the harvest. They moved with ease through the rows, laughing, teasing each other, their bond unshakable. Grace watched them from the terrace, her heart full. She saw herself in Alara's fierce independence, in Julian's quiet thoughtfulness. And she saw her mother, always, in the way they carried themselves with dignity and purpose. Grace had taken over the foundation full-time. Under her leadership, Grace Rising had become one of the most influential humanitarian organizations in the world. She had spoken before the UN General Assembly, advised world leaders, and launched a global education initiative for girls in conflict zones. But no matter how far she traveled, she always returned home, to the vineyard, to her children, to Elena. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner under the stars, Elena raised a glass of wine. To the next chapter, she said, her voice soft but steady. To legacy, Grace replied. To love, said Alara. To Nana, Julian Jr. added, grinning. They clinked glasses, laughter echoing into the night. Later, Grace found Elena in the studio, staring at a blank canvas. Thinking of painting again? Grace asked. Elena smiled. I'm thinking of finishing the one I started when you were born. She uncovered an old canvas, faded but intact. It was a portrait of Grace as a baby, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide with wonder. Elena had started it in Geneva, during those first quiet weeks with Julian. She had never finished it. Life had swept her away. Now, she picked up a brush. Over the next few weeks, she painted slowly, deliberately. Grace watched in awe as the image came to life, not just of herself, but of the journey they had taken together. In the background, Elena added the vineyard, the olive tree, the jet, and a faint silhouette of Julian, watching over them. When it was done, she titled it simply Becoming. The painting was unveiled at a retrospective of Elena's work in Florence. Critics called it her masterpiece, a culmination of a life lived fully, fiercely, and unapologetically. After the exhibition, Elena returned home and began writing letters, one for each of her grandchildren, one for Grace, and one final letter addressed simply, "To the woman I once was." In it, she wrote, "You were scared. You were hurt. But you were brave. You boarded that jet not knowing where it would take you, only that you couldn't stay where you were. And because of that choice, you found everything you never knew you needed. You found love. You found purpose. You found yourself. Thank you for choosing you." Elena passed away peacefully one morning, the sun rising over the hills, her hand resting on the sketch pad beside her bed. Grace found her there, a smile on her face, the final page of her journal open. It read, "I am not afraid. I have lived. I have loved. I have become." The funeral was held beneath the olive tree. People came from all over the world, women whose lives had been changed by Elena's words, her art, her courage. Grace gave the eulogy, her voice steady, her heart full. "She taught us that endings are not failures," she said. "They are beginnings in disguise. She taught us that love is not possession, it is presence. And she taught us that the most astonishing journey is the one we take back to ourselves." Years later, Elena would write her own book, The Olive Tree, Lessons from My Grandmother. It would become a bestseller, taught in schools, quoted in speeches, cherished by generations. Julian Jr. would become a filmmaker, creating a documentary about Elena's life that would win awards and inspire millions. And Grace would continue to lead, to love, and to live, always guided by the legacy of the woman who had once boarded a jet, pregnant and betrayed, and built a life more beautiful than she had ever imagined. Because some stories don't end. They echo. They bloom. They become the roots of something greater. And Elena Hart's story, her astonishing journey, would live on forever. The vineyard was quiet in the early morning light. Dew clung to the grape leaves, and the olive tree stood tall, its roots deep in the soil that had witnessed decades of love, loss, and rebirth. Elena Hart's portrait hung in the main hall of the villa, painted by Grace, framed in gold, surrounded by letters, photographs, and awards. Visitors came from around the world to walk the land she had cultivated, to see the studio where she had painted, and to sit beneath the tree where she had written her final words. Grace, now in her 40s, stood on the terrace with her daughter Elena and son Julian Jr., watching the sun rise over the hills. Her hair was streaked with silver, her eyes still fierce. She had become a global icon, not just for her work, but for her story. She had carried her mother's legacy forward, but she had also built her own. Elena was a writer, like her grandmother. Her debut novel, The Jet That Changed Everything, was a fictionalized retelling of Elena's journey, poetic, powerful, and deeply personal. It had won awards, been translated into 20 languages, and was being adapted into a film. Julian Jr. had become a filmmaker, directing documentaries about resilience, migration, and the power of choice. His most acclaimed work, Becoming Elena, had premiered at Cannes and was nominated for an Academy Award. Grace watched them with pride. They were the living proof of everything Elena had fought for, children raised not in wealth alone, but in wisdom, compassion, and truth. One evening, the family gathered for a celebration, the 25th anniversary of Grace Rising. The vineyard was lit with lanterns, music played softly, and speeches were given by world leaders, artists, and survivors whose lives had been changed by Elena's work. Grace took the stage last. She looked out at the crowd, thousands of faces, many of them young women who had found strength in Elena's story. "My mother taught me that leaving is not weakness," she said. "It is the beginning of becoming. She taught me that love is not what you're given, it's what you choose to give. And she taught me that every ending is a doorway to something astonishing." She paused, her voice steady. She boarded a jet with nothing but a broken heart and a child inside her. And from that moment, she built a life that changed the world. The crowd rose in applause. Later that night, Grace sat beneath the olive tree, her children beside her. She'd be proud, Elara said. She is, Grace replied. They sat in silence, the stars above them, the vineyard glowing in moonlight. And somewhere in the breeze, in the rustle of leaves, in the quiet heartbeat of the land, Elena's story lived on. Not as a memory, but as a legacy. A journey that began with betrayal and ended in grace. The vineyard was quiet again. It had been 5 years since Elena Hart passed away, and yet her presence lingered in every corner of the estate. In the olive tree she planted with Julian, in the studio where she painted her final masterpiece, and in the hearts of those who carried her story forward. Grace stood at the edge of the terrace, watching the sun rise over the hills. Her children, Elara and Julian Jr., were grown now. Elara a celebrated author and activist, Julian Jr. a filmmaker whose documentaries had changed global conversations about resilience and healing. Grace herself had stepped back from the spotlight. After decades of leading Grace Rising, she had handed the reins to a new generation of women leaders. She now spent her days mentoring, writing, and tending to the vineyard, the place where her mother had found peace and where Grace had learned what it meant to choose joy. One morning, Elara returned home with a surprise. "I've finished the screenplay," she said, handing Grace a bound manuscript. "It's based on your book, and Nana's life." Grace opened it slowly, her hands trembling. The title read, "The Jet That Changed Everything," written by Elara Black. Grace read it cover to cover. It was beautiful, honest, poetic. It captured Elena's strength, Julian's quiet love, Adrian's redemption, and Grace's own journey from daughter to leader. "I want to produce it," Elara said. "I want the world to see what she built." Grace nodded, tears in her eyes. She'd be proud. The film premiered 2 years later at the Venice Film Festival. It received a 10-minute standing ovation. Critics called it a masterwork of emotional storytelling and a tribute to the power of choosing yourself. Grace stood on stage with Elara and Julian Jr., accepting the award for Best Screenplay. She was a woman who boarded a jet with nothing but a broken heart and a child inside her, Grace said. And from that moment, she built the life that changed the world. The audience erupted in applause. Back in Tuscany, the vineyard became a sanctuary for artists, survivors, and seekers. Elena's studio was preserved as a museum. Her letters were published in a collection titled Letters to the Woman I Once Was. Her paintings toured the world. One evening, Grace sat beneath the olive tree, now surrounded by wildflowers. She opened her journal and wrote, "She taught me that endings are beginnings in disguise. That betrayal is not the end of love, it's the beginning of truth. And that the most astonishing journey is the one we take back to ourselves." She closed the journal, looked up at the stars, and whispered, "Thank you, Mom." And with that, the story came full circle. From heartbreak to healing. From silence to voice. From one woman's choice to a legacy that would echo for generations. Because some journeys don't just change lives. They change the world. The vineyard was quiet. It had been decades since Elena Hart boarded that jet, leaving behind betrayal and stepping into the unknown. What began as a desperate escape had become a legacy, a life built on courage, love, and the power of choosing herself. Now, her great-granddaughter, a young woman named Mira, stood beneath the olive tree, reading aloud from Elena's memoir. She was preparing for her own journey, a scholarship to study global leadership in Geneva, the same city where Elena had once found refuge. Grace, now in her 70s, watched from the terrace, her heart full. She had lived many lives, daughter, mother, leader, widow, and through it all, she had carried Elena's fire. Her children had grown, her grandchildren had flourished, and her mother's story had become legend. Mira closed the book and looked up. "She was brave," she said. Grace nodded. She was unstoppable. They walked together through the vineyard, the sun setting behind the hills, casting golden light across the land that had witnessed generations of healing. At the edge of the property stood a sculpture, a jet taking flight, carved from stone and wrapped in vines. Beneath it, a plaque read, to the woman who chose herself and changed everything. And so the story lived on, not just in books or films or speeches, but in every woman who dared to walk away, in every child raised with love, in every life rebuilt from ashes. Because Elena Hart's journey was never just hers.
It was a map.
A mirror, a movement. And as Mira boarded her own plane the next morning, clutching her great-grandmother's book, she whispered the words that had carried her family for generations.
This is not the end.
This is the beginning of something astonishing. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end. If you enjoyed this one, you will surely enjoy the next one. So click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next story. And don't forget to subscribe for more.